that keeps teams together, creates the institutional memory we need, and the extension agents. In other words, the frontline practitioners. There's no link between them necessarily and the policy and the science work we're doing. And they form that probably a very tangible bridge between the science community and the policy community if we have those common. We don't sustain interdisciplinary activities that foster long-term learning, which has come up in all kinds of discussions today. We moved on to talking about the fact that not only do we have to worry about climate change, but all of these systems have a lot of non-climate change related stressors affecting them. And so sort of a backdoor way to build ecosystem resiliency is the fact that we can try to minimize these non-climatically driven stressors. We actually have an example of stormwater management in terms of that, which doesn't directly affect ecosystems per se, but it has been done in the past. We also spoke about the fact that a whole system approach is necessary. Otherwise, we're going to be continually surprised when we act in crises like the Pine Beetle. The fact that right now there's not a lot of legal tools in BC in terms of dealing with water, ecosystem, and species protection. One example is the fact that there's no legal right to clean water in this province. We then went quite into depth about ecosystem-based management. And essentially, the key thing to bring out of that is the fact that we need a management system that balances ecological integrity and human well-being. And it needs to form some sort of iterative process. We can't do it today and then do it 10 years from now and not worry about it in that middle intervening period since things are changing so quickly. And we took that into the fact that we could sort of build scenarios using that as a system. So a proposition is that we could build a set of scenarios, 3 in fact. The first being sort of an artificial status quo. So don't worry about climate change in your model, build a model. And the second, then building off of that, is to accept the fact that we're in a non-stationary climate. So take our status quo model and now deal with the climate change at its own and find out where the system breaks down, essentially, so we can learn from that. And then take that and build a third adaptive model, learning from the results of the first 2, and try to put that into practice in a couple of focused pilot studies in BC. So take areas where both private foundations and government see a lot of value in protecting those areas. So you've got some hope of funding to run these programs, and then use those as pilot studies. An example that we talked about was Great Bear Rainforest, where we have actually had something work. And then also use these systems as a strategic tool for conservation. So the fact that we have to face a certain amount of reality that we need to, things are changing and some things we aren't going to be able to save. So where should we be investing and where should we be protecting? Or what do we actually protect? Okay. That's true.
But we really discussed quite a bit the technical challenges. So the first one we came up was interdisciplinary. Cross-cultural approaches are necessary. A second thing we identified was there's a need to look at existing regulations, bylaws, zoning. Sometimes they can contradict what we want to do, try to impede or slow the implementation. A solution that was suggested was to put something in practice on a small scale before actually implementing it on a larger scale so we can identify. The next thing was communications awareness definitely needs to be increased. We discussed that paradigm shifts are required. So a shift from kind of a technical approach to a more ecological approach. We looked at equity considerations. How do we share there's equal distribution? There's the questions of compensation. How do we need to provide solutions to those that are disadvantaged? We discussed motivating factors, the fact that people do not want to change unless they're absolutely forced to. So how do we motivate people to change? And statistical measuring. We discussed some kind of an integrated office that would take on a review approach, a statistical approach, and communicate the results to the public at large. The perceived threats was climate versus technical measurements. I had something more written about that. So there is a high degree of unknowns, but technologies seem to deal with certainties. So how do we compensate for that? In policy implementations, we looked at two things, basically more sticks or disincentives. And we also discussed the fact that what might actually happen is some kind of large crisis might force us to change.
One of the ideas we discussed was perceived threats. So on the one hand, we discussed this idea that, okay, everyone knows that global warming is happening and it's pretty simple, increasing temperature. But on a regional scale or local scale, it's quite more complex. You have issues of variability, space and time, and these ideas of relative change. So that can get quite complex. But on the whole, we sort of came to the consensus that the public does get it. They get climate change. So then the question is how to define the challenge in order to find solutions. And something that came out for me was this idea of ecosystem risks. And then there were sort of philosophical discussions that came out of it, like, do we consider humans, humans implicitly when we consider ecosystem risks? And then that led to the question of, well, what do we really want to think about when we want to protect or conserve ecosystems and how they're going to be changed by the climate? So then we had this sort of spectrum going from resources and human needs, so things like protecting or considering water, food, energy, health, and then going on to things that are more related to human wants rather than needs, so things like mobility. So those are the threats. And then moving on to solutions. So we kind of diverged because of ecosystem risk. We debated sort of the difference between conservation and protection, and asked questions such as, what are we conserving? Who are we conserving this for? And who is deciding what we're conserving? And what are our criteria for making our decisions? Are we basing our decisions based on realistic scenarios? And again, are we trying to conserve ecosystems for their intrinsic or utilitarian values? Let's see what else here. Yeah, so then we kind of moved back to realizing that humans are like an integral component in these changes. So similar to how we discuss like native and exotic species, we have to consider human migrations and the impacts that those will have because they're going to be substantial. So because of that, we have to consider the human factor when we implement climate change adaptation plans. And we had a couple examples of trying to preserve tigers in India, and it kind of looked like the example that considered the human factors and sort of economic forces external to the actual local area were more successful with tiger preservation. That's that. And then from that, we moved into discussing issues with the policy process, so it became clear that we have to involve local communities in developing policy. And like climate change, we'll have physical changes that will vary regionally. That the policies that will be most effective will also differ regionally, and they'll differ probably even more because you have the human factor superimposed.